Megha Joshi and I will be outlining Unit 10 of Myers Psychology's Personality. Personality can be defined as an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. The first section we'll be going over is the psychoanalytic perspective, Freud's view of personality and its development. Freud studied unconsciousness through free association and discovered psychoanalysis. Free association in psychoanalysis is a method of exploring the unconscious in which the person relaxes and says whatever comes to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing. Psychoanalysis. Freud's theory of personality and therapeutic technique that attributes thoughts and actions to unconscious motives and conflicts. Freud believed that the patient's free association, resistance, dreams, and transferences, and the therapist's interpretation of them, released previously oppressed feelings, allowing the patient to gain self-insight. In other words, finding, exposing, and interpreting unconscious intentions. Unconsciousness. According to Freud, the reservoir of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. According to contemporary psychologists, information processing of which we are unaware of. As for personality structure, there are three main sections: id, ego, and superego. Id contains a reservoir of unconscious psychic energy that, according to Freud, strives to satisfy basic sexual aggressive drives. The id operates on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification. An example of this would be a baby crying, immediately desiring food. As for the ego, it's a largely conscious executive part of personality that, according to Freud, mediates among the demands of the id, superego, and reality. The ego operates on the reality principle, satisfying the id's desires in ways that will realistically bring pleasure rather than pain. In other words, is the reality principle that allows for and handles its desires. Superego, the part of personality that, according to Freud, represents internal ideals and provides standards for judgment, the conscience, and for future aspirations, the moral compass. Freud believed that the childhood stages of development, oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, all played an important role in the development of the individual. There's fixation, identification, and the Oedipus complex that can arise. Fixation, according to Freud, is a lingering focus of pleasure seeking energies at an earlier psychosexual stage in which conflicts are unresolved. Identification is a process by which, according to Freud, children incorporate their children's values into their developing superegos after realizing that they cannot be with their opposite sex parent. The Oedipus complex, according to Freud, is a boy's sexual desires towards his mother and feelings of jealousy and hatred toward the rival father. There is a opposite version of this called the Electra complex, where it is the female who has sexual desires for the father. For this reason, Derek Drew Western wrote that most contemporary dynamic theorists and therapists are not wedded to the idea that sex is the basic of personality. They do not talk about their ids and egos and do not go around classifying their patients as oral, anal, or phallic characteristics. He does this to mock Freud, who does have a strong, wedded idea that sex is the basis of everything. Defense mechanisms. In the psychoanalytic theory, this is the ego's protective method of reducing anxiety by unconsciously distorting reality. The first example of a defense mechanism is repression. This is the basic defense mechanism that banishes anxiety arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories from consciousness. An example of this would be not remembering a traumatic incident that you witnessed. Another example of a defense mechanism would be regression. This is where an individual faced with anxiety retreats into a more infantile stage in the psychosexual stages, where some psychic energy remains fixated. Throwing a temper tantrum as an adult for not getting your way is an example of a regression. Another defense mechanism is the reaction formation. This is characterized by the ego unconsciously switching unacceptable impulses into their opposites. Thus, people may express feelings that are opposite of their anxiety arousing unconscious feelings. Being overprotective of a pet you didn't want in the first place is an example of this. Another defense mechanism is projection. This is where people disguise their own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. An example of this would be accusing your significant other of cheating because you feel that you have been unfaithful to him or her. Another defense mechanism is rationalization. This is where others use self justifying explanations in place of real, more threatening, unconscious reasons for one's actions. An example of this would be justifying why you cheated on a test by saying everyone cheats. Another example of a defense mechanism is displacement. This is where this is a mechanism that shifts sexual or aggressive impulses towards a more acceptable or less threatening object or person, as when redirecting anger towards a safer outlet. Yelling at your dog because you are mad at your wife would be an example of this. Another defense mechanism is sublimation. This is rechanneling your unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable ones. An example of this would be playing football to get your aggression out and into something more constructive. The last defense mechanism is denial, the refusal to believe the truth. Alcoholics refuse to believe that they have an alcohol problem, often in times.
Freud's teachings collected a group of followers known as Neo-Freudians, and while they accepted his basic ideas like personality structure, they placed more emphasis on how the mind copes with the environment and experience, and less emphasis on sex and aggression as all-consuming motivations. Both Horney and Adler believe that childhood social tensions are important in personality formation, while Jung placed less emphasis on social factors. Horney countered Freud's assumptions that women have weak superegos and suffer penis envy. Adler developed a popular idea of an inferiority complex, and Jung believed that our unconscious contains more than our repressed feelings. In order to study personality, psychologists develop projective tests, which are essentially personality tests where ambiguous images are designed to bring out one's inner dynamics. The TAT is a projective test where subjects are provided a random picture and asked to make up stories about said picture. The more famous of the projective tests is the Rorschach, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, inkblot test, in which people describe what they see in a series of images. Despite its popularity, however, the inkblot test has many critics and is not always reliable. When compared with modern research, most of Freud's theories fall short. One such theory is repression. When terrible trauma occurs, our mind rarely keeps memories of such trauma repressed. Often high-stress events like rape haunt the memories of survivors because high-stress hormones enhance memories. However, prolonged stress, like those in extremely abusive households, can disrupt memory. When it came to the unconscious, Freud was on the right track when he theorized that we have limited access to the inner workings of our mind. That being said, he was wrong to think that our unconscious is just full of repressed memories. But Freud's theory of defense mechanisms does have validity because people do tend to see their attitudes in others in a phenomenon called the false consensus effect.
The humanistic perspective.
The humanistic perspective focuses on studying how healthy people can strive for self-fulfillment. According to Maslow, after the basics of the hierarchy of needs are met, people seek self-actualization and meaning. According to Carl Rogers, three elements are needed for an individual to grow and to be nurtured, and these elements are genuineness and openness about feelings, acceptance, unconditional positive regard, according to Rogers, an attitude of total acceptance towards another person, and empathy, shared feelings and reflecting on their meaning.
Assessing the self. Self concept can be defined as what we think and feel about ourselves when asked the question, who am I? Rogers believed that when ideal and actual self were almost alike, we have a positive self concept. Humanistic psychologists agree that surveys and standardized tests are not a good or accurate way to measure personality. Evaluating the humanistic perspective. This is super influential in popular psychology. Critics argue that humanistic concepts are too vague and its approach are too naive. The next topic we'll be going over is the trait perspective. Exploring traits. A trait can be defined as a characteristic pattern of behavior or a disposition to feel and act, and assessed by self-report inventories and peer reports. Humanistic psychology is naive and focuses on individualism and fulfillment as steps to loving others. Assessing traits. Personal inventory tests are questions, often true or false or agree disagree items, in which people respond to items designed to gauge a wide range of feelings and behaviors used to assess selected personality traits. The Minnesota Multi-Phase Personality Inventory Test is an example and is the most widely researched and clinically used for all personality tests. Originally developed to identify emotional disorders, this is still used appropriately. This is a test that is now used for many other screening purposes. Another example is the empirically derived test, a test similar to the MMPI, developed by testing a pool of items and then selecting those that discriminate between the groups. Personal inventory tests can be graded objectively, meaning it can be graded by computer, while projective tests cannot, but this does not mean that the inventory tests are a more accurate measurement.
Psychologists believe that a certain set of factors known as the Big Five provide a good measurement for how personality can vary. I would say them, but I can't say the first one for some reason. But a good way of remembering these factors is through the acronym KNOW, hence the awkward placement of an actual KNOW on the screen. Another approach to studying personality is the social cognitive perspective, which focuses on the interactions of our traits with our situations. Reciprocal determinism shows how behavior, internal factors, and environment influences individuals. People can choose different environments based on what they feel most comfortable in, and personalities shape how we interpret situations or life as a whole. Personal control is our sense of controlling our environment rather than feeling helpless. Students with an internal locus of control might blame poor grades or their failure to study, while students with an external locus of control may blame an unfair teacher or test for their poor performance. Self-control requires attention and energy, and people can build their self-regulating capacity by doing physical exercise and time-managed study programs. The benefits of personal control are better health and morale, even if the things that you have control over are minor. So this slide exists just to provide a brief overview of the four perspectives of studying personality. So if you want to just take in the view, pause the video. So the next section of Unit 10 is called Exploring the Self, and it basically explores the question of whether we are helped or hindered by high self-esteem. Our literal self is defined as the center of our personality and the organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Our concept of self has many faces, everything between how we imagine ourselves positively in the future and how we fear ourselves regressing backwards. Moving ahead to better days and avoiding backsliding to worse days both motivate us. Spotlight effect says that we tend to overestimate how much others will notice us. For example, if we feel that we're having a quote unquote bad hair day, we tend to think everyone will notice. In truth, few do. Self-esteem is a feeling of self-worth. The positive effects of high self-esteem are numerous and substantial, and they include better sleep, a lower need to conform, and persistence in dire situations. However, low self-esteem has negative effects such as making people more likely to put down others or expressing increased racial prejudice. Much like Kanye West, we all have a self-serving bias or a tendency to view ourselves in a more favorable light, meaning that we're prone to accept credit for doing good and not bad. For example, after doing poorly on a test, students often blame the test itself or their teacher for their poor score. But when receiving a good grade, they say that they earned it. This type of bias also explains why we're prone to see ourselves as above average. People have a strong tendency to come up with excuses as to why we have more positive qualities than others. Even people who put themselves down might actually do it for the purpose of getting attention. Essentially, it's like fishing for compliments. But it is important to note that we all put ourselves down, but more often we pump ourselves up. There are two types of self-esteem. Defensive self-esteem focuses on defending yourself from quote-unquote attacks and correlates with aggression and antisocial behavior. Secure self-esteem is not as dependent on outside factors, but more on internal factors like being secure with yourself for who you are. The culture in which we grow up in and live in helps determine our values. Individualism basically consists of a person doing their own thing. Individualistic people value setting, pursuing, and achieving personal goals. Collectivism gives priority to one's group. The group defines values, which gives a sense of belonging and care. People here value being a part of a group rather than showcasing themselves. In general, Western cultures tend to place more emphasis on individualism, while Eastern cultures place more emphasis on collectivism. With that, our presentation on Unit 10, Meyer Psychology, is concluded.